and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with me, Matthew, and as always I'm joined by Joe. Today we're going to be looking at a very popular question, which is how do you know when you have enough? Our classic answer to this one will be, for everyone it depends what their retirement looks like and what they're looking to achieve, but we're going to unpack some of the stories we talk through with clients and some of the figures and targets that people might have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, most people spend their life working towards saving for the future, and it might be sort of a specific goal and objective, or just saving for the sake of saving and ensuring they can spend it in the future. But I think, yeah, it's an interesting one to look at. How do we know sort of when we've got to that point of savings where the work is actually optional and we don't have to do it, and it might help us with sort of further financial security, but we don't need it to sort of to meet our goals and objectives in retirement. And I think a lot of people do aim for that sort of arbitrary number. It might be 500,000, it might be £1 million that they want to hit before they feel comfortable retiring. But how do we get to those sort of numbers? How do we set those targets to aim? We'll obviously explore this quite a lot over the course of the episode, and hopefully give you a few things to think about what potentially could be your number and how much is enough. The jargon buster for today, we've linked in because it's about sort of how much you can sort of potentially take. Matthew, sustainable withdrawal rate, do you want to sort of run through that?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a figure that's sort of looked at by the FCA and other sort of reports, which comes out with a 4% rule, per year in retirement, and that's over, a 30-year retirement. You should have a sustainable retirement, and there's something like a 90% chance that you don't run out of money. So again, from a sustainability point of view, it's a good starting point to tell someone, whatever you've got in that flexible pot, if you look at 4%, is that going to be enough for you? However, we find as we go through the journey and talk to people about it, people don't necessarily want a linear income for life. And they might have other things that come in, like state pensions or defined benefit incomes that start at various points. So for us, the 4% rule is a bit simple, but from a how much is enough type number, someone can work backwards to say, if I want to take £2,000 net, per month, what do I need? Okay, I can work back from that with the 4% rule to feel like what's a suitable pot to start retirement with.
Yeah, and I do, as you said, I think it is maybe a little bit simplistic in the fact that it doesn't take into account all the other options that you can have. It doesn't necessarily take into account a state pension. It doesn't take into account any other guaranteed income. So yeah, we'll work through that and see how maybe you can use that to come to a figure that you want. And I think the starting point definitely for sort of getting that figure is look at yourself and look at what sort of retirement do you want. Work out what is your why. Some people say, why are we retiring? What are we wanting to achieve there? And it might be as simple as you're sick of working and therefore don't want to retire, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how much you're going to spend in retirement. What helps you sort of work that out is looking at sort of, do you have any sort of large holidays that you wanting to take? Do you have any other sort of key goals that you wanting to tick off before sort of you pass away? Do you want to stop and look after the children and that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a balance in terms of, we talk a lot about the podcast about the psychological elements of retirement. And I think what we're describing here with the one is, can the psychological bit line up with the financial bit so that someone can be confident to make that decision? Equally, when we're talking about a number, we're currently thinking about how much is enough in a pot, but people also might be working towards an age where they're saying, okay, I've got a band of figures and it's really how many years have I got left and what's the opportunity cost with time. So I think for most people, when they're approaching retirement or when they're planning for the future, it's nice to have a figure in mind or something to almost anchor towards that will then mean that when they're working hard, paying money into pensions, building wealth, they can see a tangible increase and they can say, okay, I might have a stressful day at work, but equally, this is why I'm doing it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting thing to explore because as we say with financial advice, a lot of the time it's about how you marry up the rational and the tax efficient income side of things with potentially sometimes the irrational, the behaviours and the wants and needs of an actual person. So although it might not make sense from a monetary point of view to aim for a specific age or a specific figure, because that might not mean that that's exactly how much you need. It might help get you to the point where you're comfortable retiring, which, to be honest, might be bigger than actually having enough in capital or income to spend.
Yeah, I find the majority of people who get in touch to say, I'm ready to think about retirement, they've already got enough. They've already got to a point when they're then making the conversation. So I think where this conversation is really important is maybe the younger generation who are planning towards it. And I think that's where, as you get closer to retirement, you can start to see what your expenditure looks like clearer. You can start to see what your assets and your income sources might be in retirement, and it can become a lot more real. And there can be the element there when people then say, financially, I've hit that number, I've hit something I feel sustainable, but I'm not quite psychologically ready for retirement. I still get some enjoyment out of work. I still have some purpose. I still have some identity, and I want to explore that carrying on before I'm then ready to take the leap into the next chapter.
Yeah, and I think that is the next step, really. Once you've understood what you've got to retire, you need to look at that sort of annual expenditure. And I think this is easier to do in today's terms as opposed to look at what it might cost you in 10, 20 years' time, because we don't know what inflation is going to be like. So look at sort of how you feel today, and know sort of what it costs to live that ideal retirement. And this can also be quite hard, because a lot of people are used to going to work, and they're used to that form of sort of spending where it's pretty structured. For 5 days a week, you might be in the office, you might drive there, you might buy your lunch at the cafe and come back. And when you're looking at planning the annual expenditure, you might say, oh, well, all of that's going to fall away. I'm not going to need that. And therefore, you might initially think that you're not actually spending anywhere near as much as you were when you were working. But then you also need to add back in all those other bits which you are not able to do now. It might be rounds of golf, if I'm being very stereotypical. It might be trips out with the grandchildren, that sort of thing that needs added back in to essentially work out what your base level of expenditure is.
Yeah, I think when someone, if they ring up or send a message to us saying, can you help us with a retirement plan? Some of the common questions we're asking to start with are, okay, how old are you now? When do you want to retire? What's your current level of income and expenditure? And what might change? And that's when we're starting to say, okay, is there going to be special holidays? Is there anything like moving house or home improvements that we need to factor in? Are there any large gifts that you want to make? Or is there anything that are you any of your kids getting married or grandchildren, you're going to university, all these sorts of things that we unpack. And then we start to say, okay, with those assets, income sources and pensions, and then the expenditure as we've mapped out, how can we start sort of putting the two together to see if we're on the same page? Again, there'll be some times when we look at it and we've got, a capital surplus and an income surplus, which again gives people the freedom to feel confident to jump into retirement. And then it might be on the other side, there's a bit of a deficit, and someone's then saying, okay, is it worth working for longer or saving more? Or are you happy to trim some of those expenditures and cut your cloth accordingly?
Yeah, and I think when you are looking at that sort of income, it is worth sort of splitting it out into sort of your needs and your wants. And your needs being that sort of core expenditure, your essential expenditure that you need to keep the lights on, I don't know, not sort of go out there and really live your retirement, but ensure that you're living during your retirement. And then the flip side of that is that discretionary expenditure, and that's, as Matthew said, that might be one-off discretionary. It might be sort of an initial capital injection that you want to do the holidays, or it might be just the general discretionary that allows people to enjoy their lives, sort of going out with friends, trips here and there, grandchildren, that sort of thing. So I think once you've got that and you've got sort of a sum in mind, that can then help you look backwards and sort of work back to that sort of amount of income or capital that you need in a flexible pot to achieve the income that you need. And if you don't know, because some people do find it quite hard to actually start looking at sort of what is my expenditure now, what might it be in the future. The retirement living standards numbers are a thing that we've spoke about on previous podcasts, and this is for a moderate retirement. A couple might need 43,000 per annum minimum retirement 22, and they give a few nice examples of sort of how many holidays abroad, how many times do you eat out, that sort of thing. But I would definitely use them more as guidelines as opposed to actual rules.
Yeah, I find sometimes people with those figures challenge up the figures and they say, okay, you know, I'm currently living on, you know, we've got a couple who are living on 2 state pensions, so they may be on about £24,000 per annum, but they would say, oh, well, we feel like we're having quite a luxurious retirement, but that study says we're only having a minimum retirement. I think that's where it's about the individual and what they want to spend and what they've done. I often use the example of when my granny and granddad retired. The first thing they did there was, you know, they wanted to go to America, China, travel a lot of the world. Now, you know, my granny is very happy spending time in Hexham, and that's her bubble. And if we can get her to sort of Newcastle or to visit me, that's great. But she's definitely not going to get on a plane and isn't going to go on holiday. So in terms of her expenditure, you know, the important bit for her was the early years of retirement and enjoying themselves. And now, you know, the expenditure's tailed right off, but at a point when defined benefit pension's gone up in line with inflation, state pension continues to go up. So for me, that's one of the challenges to those sorts of standards of numbers, but equally it's a challenge to the 4% rule to say, do you want a level income throughout retirement, or are you more focused on sort of front loading and you would rather take 6% or 8% or more in the first chapter up till 60 or up till state pension age, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think mentioning the 4% rule is really an interesting one, because some people might look at that and they might look at 43,000 a year and they might go, that's, if we're using the 4% rule, that means I'm going to need £1 million plus in my pension and other assets to be able to enjoy a moderate retirement. How's that ever going to work for me? I'm going to have to sort of continue working forever, essentially, till the day I die. But what this doesn't sort of include is if you add in sort of your guaranteed income sources, your state pension, your DB pensions, potential annuities that you might purchase as well. I mean, if you add the 2 state pensions in there, that's 24,000, and that 43,000 then becomes almost 20,000, which would only be a £500,000 inheritance, not inheritance pot. Been thinking too much about inheritance since the changes. I've lost myself. £500,000 pension pot to enjoy your retirement, I should say. So
I knew what you meant. So I think it's also important to think about regional things and regional differences. So if someone was on the phone today and they had £1 million in their pension and they lived in Durham, they're going to have a different expenditure to if they had £1 million and they lived in central London. So again, it's trying to think about property costs, holiday costs. It's trying to put things in those baskets of, you know, what people are spending money on and what's their priority. Again, I think if you factor in things like grandchildren going to private school, you know, that could be a significant expenditure if a grandparent's committed to pay for it. And that would quite quickly, you know, increase what you would need to take and therefore what your pension would have to be. So I think that's where the boring answer is everyone's plan is different, so everyone needs a bespoke number for how much is enough. But the more helpful one is you can work with some of these figures, some of these percentages to then start to tease out what your own retirement looks like. And then we've got a really good tool, which is cash flow modeling, where we can put meat on the bones to help people really go through how much have I got now? What income could I get? If I carry on working for a few years, what does that look like? And is that worth my while to carry on working for that extra security?
So once we've got that sort of that target of income, and it doesn't always have to be sort of a strict target, it can be something that can move up and down over the course of your retirement. Don't feel like this is set and forget. It's something that I think should be monitored, to be honest, over the course of retirement. Then we need to look at sort of what future risks might impact that income, what might make us need to change it. I mean, I think the obvious one that people are very aware of over recent years is inflation. It has been quite high. It's not quite been hyperinflation as I mistakenly said on a previous podcast.
Cost of Freddos there.
But yeah, cost of Freddos have gone up. But yeah, I think it's a really important thing to look at, because what you need to achieve your lifestyle now won't be the same as it will be in 5 years. And this, I suppose, is the really hard one. I mean, the 4% rule, which the FCA and others think is a good rule for a sustainable withdrawal rate, that actually does build in the sort of inflation aspect of it. They're essentially saying if you were to take 4% of your pension pot now, so that 40,000 on a £1 million pension pot, for example, next year you can increase that in line with inflation, and that still is going to be a sustainable withdrawal rate going forward. So it is built into that, and I suppose that's why it is smaller than what we would sometimes think of as a sustainable withdrawal rate of 6% or potentially higher.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people can get lost with in their planning is inflation, is almost saying, oh, I need to build for an income now, plus I need to factor in inflation, I need to do this, I need to do that. Having an invested pension where your asset is, going up over the long term, that is an element of inflation protection. So you're right, the 4% withdrawal rate is 4% of the pot. So it's a flexible 4%. If we get growth in the pot, you can take more. If the markets don't do as well and that pot's lower, you would take a bit less. And I think that's hard for people to think about with retirement, because they're used to, this is my salary, this is what drops each month. If anything, I might get a bonus or I might get a pay rise, not, okay, this year I've taken some money out, so 4% might be lower and I might be decumulating my assets. I think that's the bit that people can be a bit more uncomfortable with. But we heard from an economist recently who stood up and said, economists can't predict inflation, they can't predict interest rates, they can predict what will happen in the market, what will happen if this happens and the knock-on effects. And I think that's very useful for people making this sorts of planning, where you can't say inflation's been really high recently, so I want to then factor that in for the next 30 years. What you should do is say, what's the level of income that I think I'll need? What's my own basket from inflation? I might not have a mortgage to cover, but I might, spend on food, groceries, other things. How are they changing? And then you're looking through retirement at what you need. And it's more having a bit of flexibility, having some leeway. I think we've mentioned it on the podcast before that one client had got his retirement income planned to the pound and the pence, and then a few months into retirement said, okay, can I have an extra £150 a month, please, because I hadn't factored in having a coffee when I was going out to walk the dog. Again, we don't want people to be quite as micro in the detail as that. We want them to be thinking a bit more, okay, build in a surplus, build in a bit of flexibility, and that'll cover things like holidays, Christmas and the like.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're saying that, when you are planning it sort of line by line, you might plug in a growth rate, and growth rates aren't, as you said, something that we can control. We can manage them effectively in line with your risk.
Yeah.
But I mean, especially with some of the people who are in power at the moment, you don't know if Trump's going to put tariffs on or tariffs off that could have a material impact on your retirement, particularly if you're looking at something like if you're retiring and then in that sort of immediate aftermath sounds like you've dropped a bomb, that immediate sort of few years after your retirement, there's sort of underperformance of markets. That's called sequencing risk, because you've had a sequence of returns out of your pot when markets have been down, which means when the market goes back up, you don't have as much capital left within that pot to sort of enjoy that growth and get you back to where you were. So that, I think, really talks about the sort of the importance of building in contingency plans. Yeah. If there is a period of that, and the plan maybe was to use Flexi Access Drawdown to draw some tax-free cash from your pension, give yourself an option to essentially maybe look elsewhere, and that's where the sort of bucketing approach, looking at an emergency fund or setting up in cash for the first couple of years what you might spend, might allow you to get through that sort of that tough market cycle and increase the longevity of your fund. Yeah,
definitely. I think a couple of recent client sort of stories. I mean, I had a client who retired, and it was almost the worst possible time when Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and there was particular market volatility, had high inflation, interest rates going up. We also had Liz Truss and other things. In that year, to look at your pension asset that has been, the asset that's fallen in value, to say, okay, when I made the plan, this was higher. And when I made the plan, I was seeing positive growth. To actually take money from it can be quite a scary thing. So, a few individuals I can think of said, okay, in an ideal world, I want £2,000 or £2,500 per month. But in the current market condition, I can actually get by on £1,500, and I'll use a little bit more from my cash buffer to now navigate a volatile year to then say, okay, now we've got to a point that they're happy that there's a bit more stability in the world, that they could then turn up their income and then replenish their cash over time, and they hadn't compromised their retirement and they hadn't had too much sequencing risk, but they'd also still gone, well, I wanted to be retired, I still wanted to go on holidays, I still wanted to enjoy it, I just had to find a balance. In a similar way, I've got a client who was taking regular ISA withdrawals, and when Trump announced the tariffs and the markets were a little bit spooked, first thing he said was, I don't need this month's income, I probably don't need next month's income, let's review it in 3 months' time. And then when the markets again got back to above that point in stability, we said to them, let's put back on that income because now's the right time to carry on the long-term plan. And that idea of having an ideal scenario but also having flexibility helps those people ride the markets particularly well.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one. I have in the past had some clients come to me going, okay, Joe, that's great in theory, but I don't at some point when markets drop want to stop going out for coffees or enjoying my holidays, which I think is why it's not sort of a hard and fast rule. If the market goes down, we're not saying you're going to have to reduce your expenditure by £500 or not draw income this month. In fact, if you put in place a contingency of an emergency fund, instead of sort of drawing it from your pension, you could just draw it from another asset, and you're still paying yourself in the same way. You're just not paying yourself from the pension. And I think more broadly, that is something that helps people in retirement, is not just thinking of your pension as your only retirement asset. That's where stocks and shares, ISAs can come in. That's where cash can come in to build up that sort of blended retirement strategy.
Definitely, and I think the same way, I've had a few inquiries recently where they've had a real focus on inflation, and they've seen they've essentially had more assets than they felt they need. But they have got a worry that inflation will come back and will spike again. Again, we've seen it being sticky, so I can see where they're coming from. Again, they've got a choice between having capital invested that might be almost linked to inflation to some extent, or they could say, okay, well, we're going to take out some of an annuity with some inflation escalation built in to guarantee and take that risk off the table. So for us, it's someone coming to us with their objective, but also what's bringing them to the table, what's their baggage, what's their understanding of markets, what's their feeling on their own personal risk, and we can then build what's right for them. The annuity being a low risk option, but being a way of banking those essential expenditure, for example.
Yeah, and I think, the annuity is a great solution to that, because you can build inflation, you can essentially eliminate longevity risk. The only bit there is you lose out on a bit of the flexibility. And I suppose slightly in relation to annuities, the other things that you do need to think about and potential future risks is stuff like death, divorce and care fees. Not something that you necessarily, when you're planning your retirement, you want to go, oh, I can't wait for these things to happen. But it's something that you need to think about. And I suppose, again, just think about if one of those was to happen in an untimely manner, how would that impact your retirement plan? Would you need to reassess?
Yeah, I think when we do stress tests and cash flow models for people, I often say to people, we're going to kill you off on an example, and we're going to pick the worst possible time just to show that you got capacity in there, that if your 2-state pension suddenly dropped to 1, is there enough flexible funds to keep us going at that level? Expenditure might come down in general, but we don't want to force it. There has to be flexibility with that model. So I think that's definitely crucial. We often stress test a market condition like the financial crash as well, to say if someone's retiring and they've experienced that, are they going to have enough to see them through? And the other thing that you mentioned there perfectly about care is everyone's got their own feeling of what they're looking to achieve. Some people say they want to have, run down their assets so that they think, okay, well, actually, maybe there's a chance that the local authority pay for care. Other people go, okay, I also want to have a minimum of £200,000 assets available so I can choose my own level of care. And we can almost model and work with both scenarios to see what figures are required. Again, we don't know when someone's going to die. We don't know, what care costs might be. We don't know what's going to be needed. But by having a contingency in place, that can allow someone to say, okay, I need to go private for a knee replacement. I need to give some money to one of my children because they're in a bit of a financial problem. It doesn't matter how you use it. If you've got that buffer, you've got the flexibility to adjust your plan over time.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, some of the sort of common mistakes that we get to when we speak about sort of how much is enough with clients. I mean, as we mentioned at the top of the podcast, I think chasing an arbitrary target of a monetary amount that you need before you retire can sometimes lead you to maybe overworking. And by overworking, I mean, round numbers are nice. People love round numbers, and in reality, the amount of money that you spend in your retirement is not going to be a round number. It'll probably come down to, unless you round up everything when you're saving, it'll probably come down to 99p or something. Whatever's left at the end. So yeah, looking at it in more of a case of sort of when, not just monetary wise, but when you actually feel ready to retire as well is another thing, because as we've said a lot of times, it's not that sort of retire on a Friday and then pensions forever on a Monday. It can be a little bit more flexible when you come to retiring now.
Definitely. I think one thing I say to people is don't obsess about the number, but equally 10 grand or 20 grand or even 50 grand isn't a lot of money over a 30-year retirement. It's a lot of money if it dropped in your bank tomorrow or if you were spending it on something today. But actually, if you were looking for £1 million figure or £500,000 figure and you were 50 grand short, that doesn't make a massive difference over the long term, and it shouldn't be a case of can I accept a redundancy or can I afford to retire. There's a lot more at play, but it's really just trying to get the balance of, am I emotionally ready? Do I have a bucket list of things I'm looking to do? Do I know accurately what my expenditure will be? If I said to you now, put you on the spot, what will you spend in retirement? You wouldn't have a clue because of your age and your distance between it. So if I said to you, what's your magic number for your pension? You would say, I haven't got a clue because there's so much timescales between now and then that I don't know, where I'm going to be living, what I'm going to be spending, what inflation looks like, all these other things. So that's the bit that people shouldn't worry too much as long as they're on a pathway to the right sort of number. And as they get closer, that's when our tools, our expertise and our modelling can help people to be confident and be ready to, either finish or say, I'm this far away or I'm ready to partially retire or start the process, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, the podcast is about sort of how much is enough, and the risk is obviously that you don't have enough and you run out of money and you don't get to do all the things that you wanted to do in retirement. I think on the flip side, I mean, I'm really positive, and we've spoke not just generally, but I'm really positive on helping people retire early and then enjoy it while they can and while they're healthy. That whole front loading of retirement that we've spoke about so many times, and not many people think necessarily, and it's not a real risk, but the risk of almost leaving it too late to retire, of maybe you had enough money at age 55, but you wait until you're age 60. That's potentially 5 years that you've missed out on, or where you can sort of create those really powerful memories that you'll enjoy throughout your retirement. I mean, back to your sort of analogy of if you're £50,000 short of what your retirement goal is, yes, that might mean that sort of the back end of your retirement, you are only reliant on your DB pension or your state pension. Yeah. But if you're, I'm not sure if I said 50 or 500,000, but £50,000 short, but if you're £50,000 long and you've got £50,000 too much at the end of your retirement, yes, you could think that's great, I've planned correctly and I've got enough, but I suppose another alternative angle to that is if you earn £25,000 a year net, that's 2 years where you could potentially not have been working. It's hard to do, obviously, but I think it's just working out sort of mentally sort of where's right for you.
I think I've had that sort of deep conversation with quite a few clients in that situation where they can get quite upset about it because they can say at the point when I really needed the money, like, so if someone now has an excess of say 200,000 or 300,000 in their pension, which they don't expect to necessarily touch, but it's a good position to be in, they can get quite upset to say, I wish I could have given myself in my lowest time some of this money, maybe when they had a young family or a large mortgage or an interest rate of 15% on a first house. They almost go, I'm really secure now, but I've lived through a time when I wasn't so sort of confident in my finances. And I think those experiences also make people reluctant to give up the secure income, to give up the salary, to give up saving more money, and they carry on climbing that hill or the mountain. and accumulation is that scary bit. So I think the real answer to how much is enough, or when do you know you've got enough, is you probably don't. You really, you have to decide. You have to sort of come at it, and you have to take that jump, but you have to be inward looking at, what's my top priority. If I had another £100,000 to my name, do I feel happier? Do I achieve anything more? Or actually, is the next chapter of my life taken off the bucket list? And at that point, is time more valuable than the extra money?
So I think that's an important thing to talk about, what you brought up there of sort of borrowing money from now to give to your younger self. I mean, there is an argument that it makes sense to borrow against your future self, because you can enjoy yourself in those younger years. And this is where I think the concept of memory dividends comes in the fact that the majority of things that you learn in life, they'll only depreciate in value, like cars, or all those sort of material assets. But a memory and an experience that you've got, that will only become more valuable the longer that you live, and that's sort of the whole nostalgia. And when you're later on in your retirement and you're thinking about all those different things that you did, will you think, oh, am I glad that I worked those extra couple of years to get that financial security, or am I happy that I took that time to really experience those things with the family, and that'll be the sort of the real valuable bit that you'll take away sort of come the end, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable way to think about things. And I think sometimes our challenge as good financial planners is to say to people, you're on this hamster wheel. Why are you doing this? What's your plan? I mean, I remember one conversation with someone where it was a case of, we've got a pot of money and that's going to pay the mortgage. And the mortgage was exactly the same amount of money as the pot of money. And I was like, okay, so when? And they were like, when we retire. And I was like, well, why not do it now? And it was a case of, the interest rate on the mortgage might have been 5% or 6%, and the returns that they were getting on the cash ISA, for example, might have been 3 or 4. So I was like, well, let's get it done. If you've got enough, then they sent a really nice message afterwards to say, oh, that was really good, challenging us, we're reframing our thinking, but equally, we were waiting to pay that mortgage off at retirement. We've now paid off the mortgage, so in our heads, we've now pulled forward our thinking about retirement. And they then said, we've got stressful jobs, but actually you've given us a little bit of a insight into what we can start planning for and getting excited about. And they really loved it. And all I did was the common sense of just a challenge of just when, how, what you're doing, and that reframe their journey.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't all you did. I hope you were a good financial planner and
I still look after them now. So.
Well, double checked your early repayment charges and that they couldn't only go up to 10%. But no, absolutely, I see exactly where you're coming from. I mean, I think, so summarising that, how much is enough? We're probably being quite typical.
We've answered a different question.
Quite typical in financial planners in saying it depends and it's all down to sort of individual circumstances, which it is. But I think there's a lot of broad themes that you can apply to yourself and start to think of sort of that personal journey.
Yeah.
I mean, one listener's question that we've got that we'll end off on, I think is an important one, because a lot of people think of retirement, they get into it and then that's it, they're now retired. But someone asked here, sort of, how often should I review my retirement plan once I have stopped working?
It's a good question. I mean, we, from a financial planning point of view, we like to touch base with a client at least once a year just to check that plans, investment performance and everything's still in line with what they were looking to achieve in their risk. But in terms of their retirement plan, I think that's something that someone can be regularly assessing. Maybe it's every 6 months, maybe it's every year, or maybe once someone gets settled into retirement, maybe it's every 3 years. But I had someone message me over the weekend, and they've reframed their plan slightly, but only in terms of expenditure, and it's because they've recently lost their mum. So, they've recently lost their mum and they've said, okay, well, what's our priority? Actually, we're going to bring forward some of those big holidays that we had planned. We're not going to wait 5 years to go to the Caribbean. We're going to go now. So I think that's an element of, there will be things that come along, inheritance, divorce, death. There'll be things that make you reframe your own plans, but on a normal year, you're just almost having that at least annual look of how are we feeling? Are we ticking off the bucket list? Is there more we should do? And what would good look like for the next year, essentially?
Yeah, I suppose it might be different for a non-advised client to an advised client, because people that we look after, they merely see us sort of once or twice a year, but in the background we're always looking at the rest of things and looking out for those potential pain points. For someone that maybe isn't advised, you might want to look at it a little bit more often, but I don't want people to fall into the trap of over-focusing on the sort of retirement plan, checking the markets every single day that can occasionally happen. But I think more generally, you definitely need to maybe pay more attention to it than when you weren't retired. I think there's sometimes less to do when you weren't retired, and maybe you can check it less than once a year, because as long as you're doing the right things and you're following the right plan, it takes care of itself.
I guess it kind of depends. Are we thinking about the retirement plan itself, or are we thinking about the retirement journey? So is it the pension and the sort of nuts and bolts, or is it the high level looking at income, expenditure, objectives? And I think that's where someone might be looking at the bolts and under the bonnet maybe once a year, but equally they should be regularly saying, well, what is my priorities? What am I looking to achieve? And that could change depending on changes to legislation, could change depending on family circumstances. There's lots of reasons why someone might want to almost sit down with themselves or sit down as a household and say, what are we looking to do in the next 12 months, for example.
Yeah, okay. So that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much for watching. As always, if any sort of bits of the episode are interesting to yourself, or you have any questions, please leave a comment below, or send us an email at retirewell@wealthadvice.co.uk, and we look forward to seeing you again next week for another episode.